Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Today, something a little different. This is my year-end review of the heavyweight division in 2017. So I'll run through the various highs and lows in various categories, standout performers, best fights, biggest disappointments, and I'll drop a few thoughts of my own on the health of the heavyweight division at the end. So let's start with my most exciting clash in terms of action. For me, it has to be Dominic Breazeale versus Izu Agono. This encounter was on the undercard of the Deontay Wilder versus Gerald Washington fight on February 25th. Now, if you haven't seen it, search it out on YouTube. It is a good fight, a humdinger. So it started with Agono putting on a body-punching clinic over the first 2 rounds or so. Agono, who was 17-0 heading into this bout, he showed just exactly why he was such a highly touted prospect in the division. But Virgil Hunter, who was commentating the fight, he said near the end of that second round that Breazeale was getting closer to timing the Polish fighter, and it could be a very interesting round 3 and 4. And it really was. And it devolved right out into an out-and-out fan-friendly slugfest. In one of the early and brutal exchanges in the third, Agono was clipped and he went down. But instead of covering up, he actually fought fire with fire and he started unloading on Breazeale. And that ended up in this weird tackle-like movement from the American. From there, Izu teed off, but Breazeale somehow weathered the storm. And he even landed a few heavy shots of his own at the bell, and they took a toll on Agono. Good kidney punch. And by this point, both guys, they looked absolutely exhausted. They looked spent, and it was anyone's guess where this thing was going to go. And their tiredness, it was certainly evident in the first 90 seconds or so of that 4th round. But then Agono unleashed a barrage of head and body shots. And the American, well, he collapsed to the canvas as a result. Agono went in to finish Breazeale, but somehow the American survived. Somehow he made it to the bell. And lucky he did, because early in the 5th, he just floored the pole with a massive right hand. So Hunter was right that Breazeale eventually, he was going to catch up with Agono because Agono had his hands down. And that punch, it forced Agono to the mat. He had to take a knee. And from there, Breazeale swarmed Izu, knocking him through the ropes, and the ref waved it off. It really was a high-octane seesaw encounter. It really was a great advertisement for heavyweight boxing. And it was really great to see actually 2 guys of a similar ability duking it out. I can't actually help but think if Agono had have kept boxing like he had in those first 2 rounds, then he might have had a better shot of winning. And it did actually expose, though, that Agono, he has problems with his gas tank. I mean, Breazeale might have looked a bit gassed, but he kind of always looks a bit gassed after a number of rounds. But the heavily muscled Agono, he looked spent after 3 rounds. And Breazeale, he showed that while he is effectively a walking heavy bag, you can throw something and it's going to hit him somewhere. He can weather an onslaught, and he can land some devastating shots of his own. I mean, everyone always talks about how much heart Dominic Breazeale has. And he actually showed it in this fight. It was on display against Izu Agono. It ultimately put him in line for an eliminator against Eric Molina in November, which he won. It was a bit of a drab contest, that one. But now he's very high up in the WBC rankings. And he's one of the short list of guys that could take on Deontay Wilder in 2018. So next category. Most dramatic fight of 2017, and there is a difference to the earlier one. So this one, it's an easy one, and you can probably guess where I'm going with this. Vladimir Klitschko versus Anthony Joshua in April. 90,000 fans at Wembley. Old line up against the young line. 2 belts on the line. A 5-month build-up. It really would have been a massive letdown if it hadn't have delivered. But fortunately, this was one of those rare times when it not only lived up to the hype, but it actually exceeded it. Klitschko, coming off an 18-month layoff and at 41 years old, he came in great shape. and it was a very evenly fought contest until he hit the canvas in the 5th. Joshua obviously thought he had it won. He lifted his arms in triumph. But the old lion, Klitschko, he collected himself, gathered himself, somehow managed to get up and survive the round. And not only that, he was actually starting to get in a few good shots of his own by the end of that 5th round. And he actually took that momentum into the 6th round. And he ended up leveling AJ with a straight right, a special Dr. Steel hammer shot. It was the first time that Joshua had been down on the mat as a pro. And at this point, you kind of thought, well, the writing is on the wall here. Klitschko should put him away. But the hammer never came down. And for the next several rounds, he was seemingly content just to outbox the Brit. And that left the door open for the next act in this melodrama, which was to come in the 11th round, when Joshua, who was somewhat rejuvenated, he'd recovered from that knockdown in the 6th, he exploded into action and knocked Klitschko down multiple times. And eventually he was battering Klitschko on the ropes and the fight was waved off. It was a great fight. I'm glad Klitschko walked away from that getting some credit, the credit he deserved. There was certainly a sense that because he'd been grinding away in Germany for many years with his jab and grab style, that maybe he was never truly appreciated by the public at large. Sure, hardcore boxing fans did appreciate Klitschko, but it wasn't the sort of style that set the world on fire, that got people interested and captivated the casual fan. And the casual fan dominates boxing, we all know this. But with that performance, even though he lost, he won a lot of fans, especially given how gracious he was in defeat. I still wonder though, what was on that thumb drive that he was talking about ahead of the bout? The one he was talking up, but all of a sudden after the loss, nothing. All talk of it went away after the loss. For Joshua, he delivered on the night and got the W. And as a result of coming off the canvas to win, his brand and his worldwide media exposure, it just went into overdrive. It exploded. It also felt like it was a very natural passing of the torch from one champion to another, old lion to the young lion. And Joshua solidified himself at the top of the heavyweight division. And in the process, he became a unified world champion as the WBA belt was on the line. So he added that to the IBF strap that he already held. Next category, biggest upset. So I'm going to go with 2 different matchups here because one of them for me has a little bit of an asterisk next to it. And you've probably already guessed which one. Tony Bellew's victory over an injured David Haye. This was another clash with a long build-up, being announced in November 2016 and eventually taking place in March. I'm not overly high on the current version of David Haye because it's clear he's just chasing the money. He gave up a potential title shot against Joseph Parker because he wanted to fight Bellew. He wanted to go for the money. I did, however, though, expect that while he's older, he's maybe a bit slower, he's not vintage David Haye, I fully expected him heading into March 4th that he would win, that he would stop Tony Bellew. Because for me, a healthy David Haye will beat Tony Bellew all day, every day, and twice on Sundays. I just didn't see a way in which Tony Bellew could win. But we didn't see a healthy David Haye. In mid-fight, he ruptured his Achilles, it went all spaghetti on him, and he was a sitting and lame duck. And he went on, but in the 11th, after bravely sustaining 5 rounds of punishment, Haye was sent through the ropes and his team threw in the towel. And with that, Tony Bellew scored a dramatic victory. And this clash, it was definitely in the running for my most dramatic category. But it was the injury that sort of put paid to that. I mean, had Haye have come back and knocked Bellew out, had he put up that sort of performance, it definitely would have been on top. But in fairness to Bellew, he was winning rounds before the injury. He looked pretty good, actually. I think it would have been a pretty decent fight. I still would have favoured David Haye to win had he been healthy. But even in those early rounds, something looked off about Haye. His stance, it was very wide. It was off. Something wasn't right. But, he's had a few trainers. He's been out of the ring basically for 5 years. He's fought a couple of guys who, was it Jarrett Jai and Demori, basically of no note. They were just money fights. It's not the same David Haye. And as we know, since then, ahead of the rematch, Haye's injured himself again. He was going up some stairs and somehow managed to tear an arm muscle after he tripped forward. Certainly haven't heard of too many injuries like that. But in terms of a non-injury upset, I'm rolling with Alexander Dimitrenko's first round KO of the then unbeaten Swedish prospect Adrian Granat, who was 14-0 heading into their matchup. No one really saw this coming. Very early on in that first round, there was a bit of a slip. Dimitrenko had to get off the mat. Then a few moments later, he was wobbled when he took a few headshots in a clinch. It did look like it was only going one way. But even before that fight, most pundits, including myself, were expecting Granat, he would come through the step-up bout against an opponent who really had devolved into a high-level gatekeeper of sorts. Or just a gatekeeper. It's hard to really know because Dimitrenko's record is not great. Dimitrenko had a lot of promise early on in his career. And he was a former world youth champion. But for some reason, he was unable to translate it into professional success at the elite level. And part of it, I think he lacks real heart and desire. It looks like he's in there for the paycheck. Dimitrenko is the sort of guy who seems to falter when things get tough, and he looks for a way out. Every time he stepped up, he's lost. He lost against Eddie Chambers in 2009, Kubrat Pulev in 2012, and Joseph Parker in 2016, which in that matchup, he looked like he was trying to put on an Oscar-worthy performance, writhing on the ground, claiming an illegal punch. But there are no big names on his mostly padded record, which was 39-3 heading into the clash with Granat. Derek Rossi, Michael Sprott, and former WBC title challenger Albert Sosnowski being the best among them. So with all that in mind, no wonder most fancy Granat to pass through Dimitrenko and his gate. But remember, sometimes the gate is closed, and Granat found that out, with Dimitrenko felling the Swede with a perfectly timed right during an exchange in that first round. From there, it was all downhill, and Dimitrenko, he swarmed Granat after that, and the ref actually probably let things go on a bit longer than he really should have. He gave Granat a good suck of the sab on that one to come back, but in the end, he was throwing nothing back. Dimitrenko, he raced to the neutral corner, sort of climbed up on the ropes, bounded up there, and just as he was about to celebrate, it was like he was just double checking to see if it was real, if it had actually been called off. And it had, and he celebrated. And it looked to me from his reaction that not even him, he didn't think a first round KO of Granat, a highly touted prospect, he didn't think it was in the script either. He certainly didn't look like he was expecting it. He looked surprised and elated. Of course he was elated, but he looked more shocked than anything. But I guess that shows that is heavyweight boxing. One punch delivered in the right spot, it can change the game. So now Dimitrenko, he rises in our estimation. He reclaims fringe contender status, and he guarantees himself at least a few more decent paydays. While Granat, he has to regroup. He has to plan his ascent to a title shot. And that certainly was a big stumbling block, a big roadblock that he found in the form of Alexander Dimitrenko. And after that performance, certainly a lot of us, I'm sure, are wondering, is Adrian Granat the goods? Did he deserve all the hype? Or has he been exposed as another slightly overhyped prospect that was benefiting from good matchmaking until the unexpected Dimitrenko banana skin? You gotta wonder. A couple of honourable mentions for this category. In September, American Joey Abel, he knocked out Krzysztof Zimnoch in a surprising upset. And another one a month later, Kevin Kingpin Johnson, he threw the form book out the window by knocking out two-time heavyweight title challenger Francesco Pianeta, handing him his third career loss. That one really was an upset. But mostly in 2017, the form guide, it went the way it was supposed to. But then again, it has to be said, a majority of what we saw, what was on offer, it generally involved one opponent being way overmatched. That's nothing new, and it would be good to see more competitive matchups more frequently, especially in that top 30 area. Let's get to some of the lowlights for 2017. Performance enhancing drugs, PEDs for short, it loomed large over the division in 2017, seeing a number of fights cancelled as a result. Most notably, Andrzej Wawrzyk, he tested positive ahead of his bout with Deontay Wilder, and later in the year, another Wilder opponent, Luis Ortiz, failed a drugs test as well. But he claimed it was all legit and he just hadn't filed the requisite paperwork for his life-saving blood pressure medicine. Ultimately, the WBC believed Ortiz, the WBA did not. And that segues nicely into the next lowlight, the general conduct of the sanctioning bodies. The Luis Ortiz example, it's a good one. The WBC, it didn't handle the incident well. It torched Ortiz in public before it gathered any facts. It pulled the sanctioning of his Deontay Wilder fight, but then later exonerated him on medical grounds despite the failed test being a clear breach of protocol. It was a real mess and it wasn't handled well. Another head-scratching example from a sanctioning body this year was the WBA was gagging to put its belt on the line for Joshua versus Klitschko. But then it found itself in the mire afterwards, when Luis Ortiz, who was the agreed mandatory challenger, he wanted his shot at the title. But Anthony Joshua didn't want that fight next. He wanted to take on his IBF mandatory Kubrat Pulev. So of course Ortiz wanted Joshua stripped. It was a situation the WBA didn't have to put itself in. It was a very foreseeable situation. Anthony Joshua and his promoter Eddie Hearn had a well-stated intention that if a Klitschko rematch didn't happen, then the next cab off the rank was the IBF mandatory Kubrat Pulev. They'd said that all along. But the WBA, knowing all this, walked right into it, it put the belt up, it wanted it to be on the line, no matter the consequence afterwards. Well, that's the way it appeared at least. And it was another example of how these governing bodies, they put the dollar above all else. Sanctioning fees, big money. It walks hand in hand with the lack of transparency from these governing bodies. I mean, at the end of the day, on the transparency side, how much did we hear about many of the controversial situations this year? Not much at the time of these situations. Generally, it was well past after some deal had been done in a back room. And the thing is, if they don't say much, they can't be held to much. But the shady nature of the closed room deals and agreements, it leaves boxing open to criticism. And fans and boxers alike, they never really know where they stand and why and how decisions are made. And when you think about it, just really think about this. Other professional sports. How many other professional sports have so many overseeing authorities, but so little accountability to their fans and to the sport in general? There is a vested interest they have in themselves. Everything else is secondary. And it seems money is at the heart of it all. And they don't even really try to sort of paper over that. It's very apparent. Their actions, the lack of transparency, the money grubbing, it really boggles the mind. It really does. Going back to Luis Ortiz, this is definitely a lowlight for 2017. A guy who had waited so long for a title shot, he just threw it all away. He really did. And apparently over paperwork. And that in itself appears very suspect on the surface, given it was life-saving medicine that he required and had been taking for some time. But it is what it is. And with that, away went his WBA mandatory status to Anthony Joshua's belt. And of course, the WBC withdrew sanctioning for his November 4th encounter with Deontay Wilder. but Wilder, he does seem keen to potentially resurrect things in 2018. I mean, Ortiz is actually one of the few guys Wilder will get credit for beating. There's only about a handful of guys that Wilder can realistically face now, and fans will go, yep, you deserve some credit for that. So who knows what might happen and where that goes. David Price. He sticks out in my mind as someone who was in a prime position once again, but he threw it all away when he took on Christian Hammer. Just looked dreadful. He was gassed early on, and in the end, and the fight didn't go that long, was it 5 or 6 rounds? He was folded nearly in 2, unable to defend himself. I wish him luck, but his days as a contender, they are clearly in the rear view at this point in time. While the WBC rankings reflect that Dillian Whyte is the current #1 contender, I believe he really did have an off year in 2017, an off year in the ring. After beating Derek Chisora in late 2016, it was December 2016, the body snatcher, he looked like he was primed for a big year. He had a lot of buzz, a lot of hype coming off that fight. But 2017 was not kind. It was ultimately August before he was in the ring for the first time in 2017. And it was against the barely active, faded and jaded journeyman Malcolm Tan. His second bout for the year came at short notice in October against Robert Helenius, which he did win comfortably, but he didn't look great in the process. He won most of the rounds, but it wasn't exactly the quality performance that fans were looking for. But part of that was because Helenius, he just was very negative. He went into his shell after the first 2 or 3 rounds and acted like a veritable sparring partner. But it has many of us asking, how far can Whyte go? 2018 may tell us, but it would be good to see, and this is in fairness to Whyte, see Whyte's promoter Eddie Hearn of Matchroom actually give him a better suck of the sav here by signing opponents well in advance of his ring date, so he can actually get a full camp in and focus on who his opponent is. Not having signed someone like a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks before, that is not doing justice and not doing right by Dillian Whyte. He can't keep, fighting these guys at the last minute. That will end up being a banana skin for him at some point. For Whyte's sake, Eddie Hearn does need to redeem himself on this front. Lucas Browne, another disappointment for 2017. He was returning from 2 PED-related issues in 2016. He only fought once in 2017, and that was against walking heavy bag journeyman Matthew Greer. I mean, what really puts him in this low-light category for me is he had the chance to get in the ring with Dillian Whyte in October with about 6 weeks' notice, but he turned it down, and he turned it down over money. And given the matchup was going to be on the Joshua Takam undercard, it would have provided massive worldwide exposure and a good performance. It would have done wonders for Lucas Browne. But those purse splits, I think they were saying he was only going to get offered like £80,000 or something like that, $80,000. I'm not even sure what it was. But it was almost immaterial for me. Browne was coming off 2 instances in 2016 after the Chigayev fight and then a energy drink or something later in the year where the spectre of PEDs was over him. He was damaged, tainted goods. And he had a gift horse and he looked it in the mouth and he walked away. It really was bizarre. They were talking about, well, if this is a fight, this is his promoter Ricky Hatton, this is a fight the fans want, we really should do it just as bloody blah. As Eddie Hearn said, they should have been snapping their hand off, his hand off, to take that fight. And I completely agree with that. And that was a big face palm by Lucas Browne. The unbeaten Lucas Browne. If he actually wants to get in big fights, he's got to take big fights. And remember, he is firmly on the B side of the equation and probably most of the dealings that they're walking into at this point because of his recent history. He's going to have to accept less. He's going to have to give some concessions. but he could have put himself in a good performance against Dillian Whyte, and that could have opened a lot of doors. Potentially, it could have got him right up the rankings in a couple of different sanctioning bodies. But it is what it is. It's gone. Okay, next category, the Lazarus category. This has to go to Alexander Povetkin, another boxer with a PED checkered past. So the Russian shook off his 2016 problems where he had 2 PED-related issues to beat Andrei Rudenko mid-year and then Christian Hammer in December 2017. 2 good names. Well, 2 names. I mean, Andrei Rudenko is probably a bit past it now, but not a terrible name. It's not some sort of, faded journeyman. And Povetkin, his record, if you actually look at the names on it, I do believe this is one of the best, if not the best record for any heavyweight walking around today. There's a depth of names on his record going back a number of years. And he features now prominently in all the sanctioning bodies' rankings. And he could well end up becoming the mandatory to the WBO or the WBA. So 2018, it certainly shapes as a big year for the Russian. We have to see where that goes. I guess relatedly, this is what I would call the they will come again category. For this, I've picked Hughie Fury. He made Joseph Parker at times in their fight in September look a little bit ordinary. Ultimately, though, his excessive movement coupled with the lack of punches, it saw the decision go against him and go to Parker. But there was enough that I saw in Fury to know that the 23-year-old, and he is only 23, he is young and skilled. He's going to be a handful for years to come. And he will win a title at some point. He is definitely one to watch, and he will come again. And in terms of the ones to watch, top of this list for me, Daniel Dubois. Hardly a surprise. The 20-year-old, he racked up 6 knockouts in 9 rounds of action this year to kick off his pro career. Got it off to a great start. He does look the goods, but I need to see more. I need to see someone hit him back. Someone stand there who can give him some rounds so we can actually gauge what we've got. We know he has power. That's not in doubt. But what about his chin? What about his gas tank? His ability to push through some adversity. So these are some of the things in the next year or so I'd be very keen to see. He really is a blue chip prospect. But I think we have to temper expectations a tad until we actually see him successfully work through the levels. I know Frank Warren, his promoter, believes he can soon foot it with Joseph Parker. But for me, it would be a travesty if Dubois was pushed too quickly and came unstuck because they put him in against someone that he wasn't ready for. As they say, it can take years to build up a heavyweight, but just seconds to tear one down. He's only 20. Just 20. So I do not see the harm in another at least 10 bouts or so where he's progressively stepping up the competition, putting his work in the gym into action in the ring, where you'll be able to see him learning. Fight to fight, you can see the progression. I mean, it's a well sort of traveled ground that most boxers go through. And I don't, it wouldn't be good if he was pushed too quick and he came unstuck. I hope they are careful and cautious with him. He's only 20. He's got a lot to offer, and he is going to be on the scene for years to come. He could be a very good champion. Another blue chip prospect I'm excited about is Filip Hrgović, who's had 2 bouts and he's got 2 KOs under his belt. The 25-year-old, he has good amateur pedigree, and he will, in the next couple of years, I think, be one of the best in the division. His promoter, Kelly Sutherland, he says if they were to put on a World Super Series of boxing for heavyweights, he'd be pushing to have Hrgović in there with the top 5 guys in the world right now. That's how confident he is. But I guess, like Dubois, I hope his promoter does give Hrgović enough time to find his feet, get his feet under the table at the pro level. Don't rush him before his time. I guess a couple of honourable mentions would be Joe Joyce. He's obviously being pushed along quite quickly by his promoter David Hay, and in that same stable is Tony Yoka. Yoka I'm not as convinced about. I think all the other guys that have named so far and the ones to watch, I think they will have better careers than him, but you just don't know. I need to see more from him first. Okay, on to the champions and my take on how their respective 2017s went. I'll start with Joseph Parker. From me, he gets a pass mark for the fact that he basically just held on to the strap in 2017. Wasn't a great year by any stretch, and even Parker himself has admitted it hasn't quite gone to plan. And some of that was the massive delay with getting the Hughie Fury fight done. In May, we saw a last-minute voluntary defence against the Romanian Razvan Cajanu, and that was, of course, after Hughie Fury, his mandatory challenger, pulled out of the fight because of an alleged back injury just 2 weeks out from fight night. Parker, he was pressed into action against Cajanu, the late replacement. They were actually sparring partners. They'd sparred more than 100 rounds together in the months leading up to that. Parker, he got past Cajanu. He won all but maybe one round in that fight. It went the distance, but it wasn't a great fight. Parker had some good, did some good things in there, especially in the first few rounds. He was working well. He was racking up the points, but he never hurt Cajanu, and he failed to deliver on the promise of a knockout, which fans were very eager to see, especially because questions about Parker's power at the elite level, they were starting to be asked more and more. He got by him. That was the main thing. In September, the showdown with Fury, it did eventually take place, but not in Auckland, New Zealand as was originally planned, but now in Manchester, England. His team Duco Events, they ceded control of the promotion to Hennessy Sports. And the promotional side of things, probably the less said the better because it was a disaster. But the fight itself, it was an absorbing contest, but a bit of a stinker stylistically. I mean, for 12 rounds, you had the aggressor in Parker trying to chase down Fury, who was constantly on the move. Neither man was really able to land any devastating blows, but ultimately the judges rewarded Parker for his intent, and overall he did land the heavier blows overall. It was a good win. Fury is a good name. As I've already mentioned, he's one to watch in the division in future years because he's got some good skills, some good silky skills, but he just didn't punch enough. He didn't engage Parker enough, but maybe that was because he didn't want to feel Parker's power. I mean, who knows? Ultimately, the excessive running, the London Marathon style run that he went on, it worked against him. But that encounter, it did expose a few things that Parker's got trouble with. He couldn't cut off the ring effectively during that fight. And again, when his game plan wasn't being executed successfully, he seemed a little bereft of ideas about what to do next. All it was the same sort of just come forward, throw a big right. And his jab, his head movement, they both evaporated after the first few rounds. I mean, some of those things are actually, a lot of us who are Joseph Parker fans, and I am, we've commented, especially the head movement and the jab, those are things you want to see continue throughout the fight. But for whatever reason, they just, after about the third or fourth round, seem to get put away in the pocket and they don't come out again. And that's something he's going to have to work on. But pleasingly, though, the fitness work that he had put in the camp for Hughie Fury, it really did pay off. He had a much improved gas tank for Fury. As opposed to some of the earlier fights where he did appear to sort of gas out later on. So he did actually look like he was in really good shape. It appeared Parker would squeeze in a voluntary defence before the year was ended, but his promoter Duco Events ultimately shelved that, claiming everyone was trying to lowball them. I mean, this was a voluntary defence that they had, so they could have taken anywhere, gone anywhere, done anything. It did appear to me that potentially they were overvaluing Parker's worth and asking for just too much. But, we don't know the offers because they didn't tell us. but they were saying every single offer that they had was nowhere near what it needed to be. So if that's the case, does that mean they were just asking for too much? We'll have to see. But what they did do instead was they quite smartly opted for a camp to be held, a fitness/weight loss camp with a new personal trainer. They want Parker to trim down. They want him to be in the high 230s. He's coming at 246 and 250 for his last couple of fights. And I do believe Parker will look better at that lower weight, because he did look better at that lower weight. And in general with Parker, he's got some great skills. I do think he's in general a bit underrated in the division. Not massively, but a bit underrated. But part of that is he hasn't put together a dominant or complete performance since steamrolling Alexander Dimitrenko about 18 months ago now, or 14, 16 months ago, whatever it was. I do feel the effort's underway to bring his weight down, to get his fitness up, improve his footwork, get him in the high 230s. It's going to help him, specifically with his speed, his timing, and his general fluidity as a fighter. 2018 shapes as a massive year for Joseph Parker, with a potential unification clash with Anthony Joshua looming, details of which had not been confirmed at the time this video was published. Okay, Anthony Joshua. He had a good year, but like Parker, he only fought the 2 times. In April against Vladimir Klitschko, and then in late October against stand-in opponent Carlos Takam. So I've already covered off the Klitschko win earlier, and it certainly solidified Joshua as the man to beat in the heavyweight division. For all the talk from the detractors that Klitschko was old and past it, hadn't fought in 18 months, etc., it still doesn't change the fact that that version of Klitschko is still better than any name on Deontay Wilder or Joseph Parker's records. It was a signature win. Outside of Alexander Povetkin, who has a slew of good names on his record, as I've already mentioned, Joshua has one of the best resumes of any heavyweight running around right now. And that was enhanced in October by adding the tough Carlos Takam to it. And I know a number of pro-Wilder fans in particular, they have been trying to talk down the Klitschko and Takam wins. Those 2 guys are better than any name on Deontay Wilder's record. For me, that's a fact. I mean, the simple fact is, though, the French citizen has been a top 15, top 20 guy, and possibly higher at times, for a number of years now. And that's because he is a good boxer, he is dangerous. It may not have been the prettiest win of Joshua's career, but it was a good win, a good name for the resume. But as I've noted in a previous video, I do think we are getting to the point in Joshua's career where all his future matchups are going to be tough. So I'm not sure he will be able to live up to the hype and the mythology that has been created around him that surrounds his career. It's a very tough situation that he's in right now, where a fan base expects you to steamroll every opponent, culminating with a spectacular KO every single time. The weight of expectation is huge. It could end up being a burden that ultimately trips him up as he goes for that knockout punch. We'll have to see. I would note, both Wilder and Parker, they were seemingly able to get under Joshua's skin at various times in the latter half of 2017 through constant haranguing through the media and attacking his pride, a direct attack on his pride. And sometimes Joshua's responses, they didn't quite hit the mark, and he came off actually looking a bit thin-skinned. Whether this is an actual chink in his mental armor, it remains to be seen. But it was interesting to see the way in which he responded when someone else was controlling the narrative in the media and actually landing a few blows against him. He didn't like it. Overall, I'd give Joshua an 8 out of 10 for 2017. Probably would have been a little bit higher if he had have been more active. if Joshua vs. Parker is made for 2018, it'll be great for boxing. If it's Joshua vs. Wilder for 2018, it'll be great for boxing. Great exposure for the sport. And it brings the prospect of an undisputed champion being crowned somewhere down the line if the cards fall the right way. I'm not so sure that 2018 is going to be the year of undisputed, just simply because, money makes the world go round. And say, for example, either Joshua or Parker, if they get that fight made, and that's no guarantees at this point, but it's looking pretty promising, whoever wins from that has to, fight Deontay Wilder. Wilder will want 50%. He want an even cut of the pie. I'm not sure whoever is in the position with 3 belts, if it goes that way, will want to give Deontay Wilder 50%. 3 belts versus 1. You can kind of see, you get into this sort of conundrum where, all sorts of arguments come into play and you get to a bit of a stalemate. And it's almost been that way with the Joseph Parker, Anthony Joshua negotiations to a point. But they're headed the right way. We'll have to see where it goes. Okay, now on to WBC champion Deontay Wilder. Like Parker, I give Wilder a pass mark for just simply holding on to his belt in 2017. And like Parker and Joshua, he only had the 2 fights in 2017. One against a stand-in opponent in Gerald Washington in February, and the other a rematch against his mandatory challenger Bermane-Stiverne. So Washington, he was pressed into action against Wilder after the Bronze Bomber's original opponent Andrzej Wawrzyk tested positive for a PED. But while you often actually get a worse matchup after something like that happens, Washington was generally viewed as a better and stiffer challenge. Certainly Wawrzyk, he was at 15 in the rankings, Washington was at 10 in the WBC's rankings. And the prime reason, actually, if you go back to it and actually look at the time, the reason they were going for Wawrzyk was he was chosen because Wilder wanted to basically test his hand and his injuries. He had sustained damage to his, he'd torn a bicep, he'd hurt his right hand, had to have it surgically repaired when he fought Chris Arreola. So effectively, he wanted to have a tune-up fight against Wawrzyk. I mean, fans were at the time a little bit divided whether that was actually a good thing as a champion, whether you can actually do that. But I guess that's the thing. You've got 15 guys to choose from. It's within the rules, so it is what it is. So while Washington, he was a good replacement, he didn't win. He did manage to make good use of his jab, and his overall boxing skills in those first few rounds. Came to round 5 though, and Wilder kind of had enough, dropped him, and then stopped him. He came in with some of those trademark windmill action, and, it was all over. And one thing that you can't doubt about Deontay Wilder is his power. He might let himself get outboxed for a few rounds because he wants to watch, he wants to wait, he wants to just, measure the distance, look for weakness, all those sorts of things. But if he lands clean, and when he lands clean, because he does, whoever is on the end of that punch, they are in trouble. So Wilder then went into this weird sort of hibernation for a number of months after that February 25th win. We barely heard or saw from him until around the middle of the year. Later he did reveal he was nursing a few injuries and that sort of thing. But primarily he'd been ordered to face Bermane-Stiverne, his mandatory challenger, but he didn't want to fight him. And it became increasingly clear he had no interest in doing so. He didn't want to take on his own leftovers that he'd disposed of so brutally, so easily a few years earlier. Couple that with the fact that fans did not want to see that matchup. They didn't want to see the repeat, the rematch. Stiverne somehow was installed by the WBC as the mandatory despite only having one fight since January 2015, since that loss to Wilder. And in that sole win over Derek Rossi, he was knocked down, he didn't look good. And it also emerged, part of the delay seemed to be the TV networks, they had no interest in a Deontay Wilder Bermane-Stiverne rematch. And understandably, fans didn't want to see it. Why would the TV networks want to put it on if no one was really interested in watching? But despite Stiverne's insistence, that he was next in line, he was stepping aside for no one, he ultimately stepped aside. He took some step-aside money to allow Wilder to face Cuban southpaw Luis Ortiz. As I outlined earlier, Ortiz failed a drugs test in the lead-up to that fight, and his sanctioning was withdrawn. So Wilder, he was in the unenviable position of having 3 opponents fail drug tests in the span of 18 months. That, coupled with a developing war of words with Anthony Joshua on social media, it prompted Wilder to claim he was the most feared heavyweight of all time. He also went in on Mike Tyson's record, and he also later challenged fans, the media and YouTubers to actually do their research about them before they talked about Deontay Wilder. He didn't think he was getting the respect he deserved. So anyway, with the slot now open, Stiverne, he was reinstalled as Wilder's opponent for November 4th. And while the build-up was brief, the fight was even briefer, with the Bronze Bomber absolutely devastating the clearly out of shape and overmatched Haitian in less than a round. It was a demolition job. It wasn't the fight fans wanted, but at least Wilder delivered an emphatic KO to send a message to the rest of the division. Ultimately, he would have been chastised if he had have struggled against Stiverne, so he did what he had to do. He got him out of there. All in all, though, we've had another year where Deontay Wilder's promise has gone unfulfilled. 3 years as champion, and we still don't know how good this guy is, as he hasn't faced anyone of any real consequence. And sure, he had the situation with Povetkin last year and Ortiz this year, but ultimately he will only get the credit he desires by fighting and beating the best. You don't get credit for the guys you didn't fight. You don't get credit for call-outs. We need some names. He needs a signature win, and he's making steps towards that. The Luis Ortiz fight would have been a great fight for Deontay Wilder's record. 2018 could be a huge year, though, for Wilder. A career-defining year. But will his handlers put him in a position in the ring to be in there with the best? Because they haven't managed, for the most part, to do that so far. I hope he does get the fights that he deserves, because I want to know how good this guy is. I'm sure a lot of fans feel that way. Because at the moment, with his record, it feels inflated because there are no big names on there. It's nowhere near as bad as an Alexander Demetrenko, but you know what I mean. You can't keep fighting guys that are overmatched, that you're expected to beat, and then go, well, I'm a legend, I'm the most feared heavyweight of all time. And that goes for the other champions, and it goes for the other top contenders, like Ortiz, Povetkin, Miller, White, Pulev. We need to see some of these guys fight each other. The top guys just aren't testing themselves against similar level opposition nearly enough. There seems to be this fixation with holding on to an O until they have a title shot, and then protecting that one loss until they get another title shot. Far too often things are too contrived, too manufactured, and in many ways it's very hard to get a true picture of the heavyweight division, and it's difficult to separate the contenders from the pretenders. But in fairness to 2017, it was a decent year for the heavyweights. We had some good matchups, we had some memorable and exciting fights, we had some really good trash talk. Jarrell Miller, he is a good example. He really was good for the division in terms of actually just giving it a bit of spark. And there was a large measure of drama and intrigue during the year. If 2018 is anywhere near the same, we're in for a good year. I'm keen for you to wade in on the categories that I've covered, but also you may have a couple of categories of your own that are worth a mention in the comments. If you do, drop it, let me know what you think. Who's your best, your worst, the highs, the lows for 2017? I will make one prediction for this time next year though, and we can revisit it in a year's time. I think just one of the current heavyweight champions will be holding their belt at this time next year. and not just because unifications have occurred. And I'm not sure who that guy will be, but I think we're in for a shake-up in 2018. I think it will be a year of change. What do you make of it? What do you make of my year in review? The 2017 heavyweight scene that was. Drop a comment loud and often, hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.